At 88, when silence has begun to feel heavier than applause, Robert Redford chose to speak. Not about the films that shaped generations, not about awards, not about the carefully guarded myth that followed him for more than 6 decades, but about love. The kind of love that does not belong to youth or spectacle, but to survival. His voice, measured and low, carried no desire to impress. It moved slowly, as if every sentence had to cross years of memory before reaching the surface. There was no performance left in it. Only truth, stripped of decoration. For most of his life, Redford mastered the art of absence. He learned early that fame demands distance, that the more the world wants to know, the more one must protect what matters. Audiences saw freedom, confidence, a man seemingly untouched by doubt. What they did not see were the quiet fractures beneath that image. Long before Hollywood claimed him, before cameras and premieres, there was a restless young man in Los Angeles, drifting through nights of excess and rebellion, unsure of who he was meant to become. In those years, one presence anchored him. His mother believed in him when he had no direction, no discipline, no sense of future. When she died suddenly, that anchor vanished, leaving behind a wound that never fully healed. That loss shaped everything that followed. Love became inseparable from fear. Attachment carried the shadow of disappearance. Redford did not articulate this in psychological terms, but it lingered beneath his words. He spoke of restlessness, of searching, of trying to outrun grief without ever naming it. Success arrived quickly after, almost violently. Roles turned into fame, fame into power, power into a public identity that left little room for vulnerability. He learned to survive by controlling what the world could see. Emotional restraint became a skill as necessary as acting itself. When he spoke of love at 88, it was clear he was not revisiting romance for nostalgia. He was explaining a life pattern. He acknowledged, carefully, that some relationships began not from certainty but from need, from the desire to stabilize chaos, to replace what had been lost too early. There was no bitterness in his tone, only clarity. He had loved deeply, but often from a place shaped by unresolved grief. That realization, spoken so late in life, carried the weight of decades spent understanding himself in fragments. The tragedies did not stop with his youth. Loss returned in forms no parent expects. The death of a child leaves no language adequate enough to describe it, and Redford did not try. Instead, he allowed silence to do the work. His pauses were long, his gaze distant. Those moments explained more than detailed recollection ever could. Grief did not make him public. It made him quieter, more guarded. Fame, once a shield, became a wall. The world continued to see strength, while privately he learned how to endure. What makes his confession resonate is not revelation, but restraint. He did not dramatize. He did not frame his story as redemption. He spoke as someone who understands that life rarely resolves itself neatly. Love, he implied, does not arrive on time. Sometimes it comes only after illusions have collapsed, only after ambition loosens its grip, only when a person no longer needs to be saved, admired, or reassured. Redford described love not as intensity, but as recognition, as the rare experience of being seen without expectation. After years of relationships influenced by fame, projection, and public identity, that distinction mattered deeply. He spoke of connection formed without performance, without history imposed by reputation. In those words was a quiet admission that for much of his life, he was loved for who the world thought he was. And that difference, subtle but profound, shaped his understanding of intimacy. There was also gratitude in his voice. Gratitude not only for companionship, but for timing. He seemed aware that love found too early might not have survived who he was then. You've carried too much noise, too much urgency. Only later did he possess the stillness required to receive love without fear of losing himself. This was not regret. It was acceptance. a recognition that every chapter, even the painful ones, led him to a place where love no longer needed to rescue him. The confession ended without finality. No sweeping statement, no cinematic closure, just a sense of peace that comes from having nothing left to protect. Redford did not offer answers meant to satisfy curiosity. He offered perspective. That love, when stripped of fantasy, is less about possession and more about presence, less about intensity and more about endurance. In speaking now, he allowed the world a glimpse of the man behind the legend, not to dismantle the myth, but to humanize it. His story suggests that even the most admired lives are shaped by quiet griefs and delayed understandings, and that sometimes the greatest love is not the one that defines youth, but the one that arrives when silence finally feels safe. Long before the world learned to associate his face with freedom, charisma, and quiet authority, Robert Redford was a boy growing up in Los Angeles who felt profoundly out of place. He was not raised in privilege, nor did he follow a clear path toward greatness. His early years were marked by restlessness and a persistent sense of disconnection. School offered little structure for him, and discipline was something he resisted rather than embraced. Teachers remembered him as intelligent but unfocused, a young man with energy that had nowhere constructive to go. At home, stability was fragile, and the emotional center of his life rested almost entirely on one person. His mother, Martha Hart, was the quiet force that held his world together. She was attentive, observant, and deeply invested in her son's future, even when his behavior suggested he was headed nowhere good. While others saw rebellion, she saw potential. Her belief in him was not loud or theatrical, but consistent. She encouraged him when he drifted, defended him when he failed, and trusted that something meaningful would eventually emerge from his uncertainty. For Redford, that faith became foundational. It was the first experience of being truly seen, not for what he was doing wrong, but for what he might become. Adolescence, however, pulled him in the opposite direction. He fell in with crowds that valued excess over purpose. Alcohol, long nights, and impulsive behavior became ways to silence an inner confusion he did not know how to articulate. He later admitted that during those years he felt lost, angry, and unmoored, moving through life without a compass. The future felt abstract, almost irrelevant. What mattered was escape. His mother worried, but she never withdrew her support. That unconditional presence was the only thing preventing him from slipping completely out of reach. The turning point did not arrive cleanly or heroically. It came through loss. When his mother died, suddenly while he was still very young, the shock was total. She was only 40, and her death was not just unexpected but deeply tied to sacrifices she had made for her family. The doctors had warned her against further pregnancies, yet she chose to risk her own health in pursuit of the family life she dreamed of. That choice ultimately cost her life. For Redford, the knowledge that her death was connected to love and sacrifice created a complicated emotional legacy. Grief mixed with admiration, guilt, and a profound sense of injustice. Her absence left him unanchored. The one person who had believed in him without condition was gone, and the world felt colder almost overnight. He carried that loss silently, unsure how to process it. Instead of breaking down, he hardened. The recklessness of his youth did not disappear immediately, but began to shift. Pain forced him to reflect, even if he did not yet know how to heal. In the years that followed, he struggled with direction, drifting through art, travel, and experimentation, searching for something that could replace the sense of purpose he had lost. Paris became a temporary refuge. There, far from expectations and familiar judgments, he lived simply, drawing on sidewalks for small amounts of money, immersing himself in art rather than ambition. Acting was not yet the goal. Painting and visual expression felt more honest, more intimate. Those months were formative, not because they led directly to fame, but because they taught him how to exist without applause. He learned to observe, to sit with silence, to value creativity for its own sake. That sensitivity would later inform his work on screen, though at the time, it was simply a way to survive. Eventually, circumstances pushed him back toward structure. Acting offered a path forward, not as a dream, but as a discipline. Training gave him focus, and early opportunities provided validation that he could commit to something fully. As his career began to take shape, he carried with him the unresolved grief of his mother's death. That loss influenced how he approached relationships. He gravitated toward stability, toward people who offered grounding rather than excitement. Love became a source of safety more than passion, a place where chaos could be quieted. Marriage and family followed relatively early, not as a culmination of certainty, but as an attempt to rebuild what had been taken from him. He found comfort in domestic life, in the idea of creating something lasting. Yet even as his professional life accelerated, personal tragedy returned. The loss of his first child was devastating in a way that echoed the pain of losing his mother. Once again, love was paired with absence. Once again, the future he imagined was rewritten without warning. These experiences shaped a man who learned to compartmentalize. On screen, he became confident, composed, almost invulnerable. Off-screen, he learned to keep his inner life guarded. The public never saw the full weight of what he carried because he never allowed it to surface. He believed that survival required restraint. Fame rewarded that belief. The more controlled he appeared, the more the world admired him. But beneath the success, something remained unresolved. Love, family, and loss were never clean chapters for him. They overlapped, collided, and left marks that time alone could not erase. By the time he reached the height of his career, he was already a man shaped by grief more than triumph. That context matters because it explains why love, later in life, took on a different meaning. It was no longer about building a future or proving resilience. It was about companionship without fear, connection without the constant threat of disappearance. This past, layered with early loss, artistic searching, and repeated grief, forms the emotional foundation of everything he would later say about love. His confession at 88 did not emerge from nowhere. It was the result of a lifetime spent learning, slowly and painfully, what love could not be, before finally understanding what it could be. By the time Robert Redford reached the later chapters of his life, the accumulation of loss had quietly reshaped him in ways the public never fully grasped. This was no longer the period of becoming, nor the era of ascent. It was a stage defined by reckoning. The man who once outran grief through movement, work, and discipline now found himself standing still with it. Age removed the illusion that pain could always be postponed. What remained was memory, and with it, the emotional weight of events that had never been resolved, only endured. The most devastating of those events did not belong to distant youth, but to adulthood, when resilience is expected and vulnerability is rarely forgiven. The death of his son James marked a turning point that could not be disguised by composure or professional purpose. James had inherited his father's values more than his fame. He cared deeply about the environment, about storytelling with intention, about responsibility beyond self. Their bond was built not on public legacy, but on shared conviction. When illness took James at the age of 58, Redford was forced to confront a truth no philosophy could soften. Success does not shield a parent from grief. Wisdom does not make loss intelligible. It only deepens the awareness of what has been taken. In the months that followed, those close to him described a withdrawal that was not dramatic but profound. He did not retreat from the world entirely, yet something essential shifted. Conversations grew shorter. His presence became quieter. He listened more than he spoke. The familiar discipline returned, but this time it was not about control. It was about preservation. Grief, once again, demanded silence. But unlike earlier losses, this one arrived when there was nowhere left to run. Fame no longer distracted him. Work no longer offered escape. The world expected dignity, and he delivered it, but privately, the cost was immense. This period forced a reevaluation of relationships. Love could no longer be approached as refuge or repair. The emotional stakes were too high, the consequences too real. Redford understood that intimacy built on dependency would not survive another rupture. He needed something different now, something quieter and more stable. Not passion that burned, but presence that endured. That realization did not come suddenly. It emerged slowly, shaped by grief that refused to be hurried. Those who observed him during this time noted a subtle transformation. He became less concerned with narrative, less interested in how events appeared from the outside. There was no attempt to frame loss as meaningful or instructive. He rejected the language of lessons. Pain, to him, was not a tool for growth. It was simply a reality that demanded respect. This perspective altered how he spoke about love. No longer idealized, no longer burdened with expectation, love became something measured in consistency rather than intensity. It was during this emotional recalibration that he spoke, later, about the love of his life. The confession did not focus on romance or chronology. It focused on difference, on the distinction between being admired and being understood, between being supported and being known. Redford acknowledged, implicitly, that many earlier connections were shaped by his public identity, by what others projected onto him. In contrast, this later love existed outside that framework. It did not ask him to perform or to heal. It simply allowed him to exist. The significance of this shift cannot be overstated. For a man who had spent decades guarding his inner world, the experience of being accepted without interpretation was transformative. It did not erase grief. It did not restore what had been lost. But it offered companionship that did not compete with sorrow. That coexistence was new. Love no longer demanded that pain be hidden or resolved. It acknowledged it quietly, without insistence. In speaking about this stage of his life, Redford did not dramatize the contrast. He did not condemn the past or romanticize the present. His tone suggested understanding rather than judgment. He recognized that earlier versions of himself could not have sustained this kind of love. Youth was too loud, ambition too consuming, grief too raw. Only after loss had stripped him of illusion did he develop the stillness required for this form of connection. There was also an acceptance of time. He understood that love arriving later carries different responsibilities. It is not about building a future in the conventional sense, but about sharing what remains. That awareness infused his words with humility. He spoke as someone who knew that love does not owe anyone longevity, that its value is not measured by duration, but by authenticity. This perspective emerged not from optimism, but from lived experience. Friends noticed that in this period, Redford appeared lighter in certain ways, despite the weight he carried. Not joyful, but grounded. He no longer resisted solitude, nor did he fear it. Love became an extension of that equilibrium rather than a solution to imbalance. This was perhaps the most radical change. The man who once sought stability through others now found stability within himself, allowing love to exist without pressure. The public, accustomed to grand narratives, often misunderstands such transformations. They look for declarations for defining moments. Redford offered none. His confession was understated because his understanding of love had matured beyond spectacle. It was no longer something to be claimed or celebrated loudly. It was something to be protected through discretion. This stage of his life reframed everything that came before. Losses that once felt unbearable were now part of a continuum rather than isolated tragedies. They shaped him, but they did not define him entirely. Love, too, became part of that continuum. Not a climax, not a redemption, but a presence that accompanied him forward. In this context, the confession carries its true weight. It is not about identifying a person, but about articulating a transformation, about recognizing that the deepest love may not arrive when one is ready to conquer the world, but when one is finally ready to sit quietly within it. Redford's story, at this stage, is less about romance and more about acceptance. Acceptance of loss, Acceptance of limitation. Acceptance of love as something gentle, resilient, and profoundly human. The consequences of everything that had come before did not arrive with sudden collapse, but with a gradual narrowing of Redford's world. By this stage, Robert Redford was no longer surrounded by constant motion or the demands of proving relevance. What followed loss was not chaos, but a quieter reckoning that reshaped how he related to people, work, and even himself. The impact was subtle yet irreversible. Those close to him sensed it not through dramatic gestures, but through what he chose to withdraw from and what he chose to protect. Professionally, he began stepping back with intention. This was not retreat born of fatigue alone, but a recognition that constant exposure no longer served him. The camera, once a place of control, now felt intrusive. He became selective, deliberate, unwilling to lend his presence to anything that required emotional performance rather than purpose. This decision surprised many, but to him it felt necessary. After decades of shaping narratives for the public, he no longer wanted to live inside one. The loss he carried had stripped away the desire to explain himself. Emotionally, the effects were deeper. Grief altered his internal rhythm. He moved more slowly, listened longer, spoke less. Conversations that once might have drifted toward ambition or memory now centered on meaning. There was no bitterness, but there was distance. He learned which relationships could withstand silence and which required constant reassurance. The latter quietly faded. What remained were connections grounded in respect rather than expectation. This narrowing was not loneliness. It was clarity. The impact on family dynamics was particularly profound. Redford understood that grief does not remain contained within the person who experiences it most directly. It reverberates outward, reshaping how families communicate, how they support one another, how they avoid certain subjects entirely. He became more protective of private moments, more aware of the emotional cost of exposure. The public had always been curious about his life, but now curiosity felt like intrusion. The boundaries he set were firm, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. This period also forced him to reconsider the nature of legacy. For years, his work had spoken for him. Films, institutions, causes carried his name and values forward. But loss reframed that perspective. Legacy became less about what remained visible and more about what endured quietly. The influence he had on those closest to him mattered more than how history might summarize his achievements. This shift did not diminish his pride in his career, but it recalibrated its importance. Accomplishment without connection now felt hollow. Public reaction, predictably, struggled to keep pace with this transformation. Audiences accustomed to seeing him as an emblem of independence projected narratives of retreat or decline. Redford ignored them. He had learned long ago that public interpretation rarely aligns with private truth. What mattered was the internal balance he was cultivating, one that allowed grief and gratitude to coexist without conflict. This balance did not eliminate pain, but prevented it from consuming everything else. The most significant consequence, however, was how he experienced love in this phase of life. Love no longer existed in opposition to loss. It existed alongside it. This coexistence required a kind of emotional maturity that earlier versions of himself did not possess. He no longer sought reassurance that love would remain. He accepted its impermanence without fear. This acceptance did not weaken attachment. It strengthened it by removing the anxiety that once accompanied intimacy. Those around him observed that he became more present in small moments. Walks without destination, conversations without agenda, shared silence without discomfort. These were not escapes from grief, but acknowledgments of life continuing despite it. Love, in this context, became an anchor rather than a distraction. It did not ask him to forget. It allowed him to remember without drowning. The cumulative effect of this transformation was a man less interested in being understood and more committed to being honest with himself. The need to explain, justify, or contextualize his experiences faded. He did not frame loss as something that had made him stronger or wiser. He simply accepted that it had changed him. That acceptance was perhaps the most lasting consequence of all. In interviews, his words reflected this restraint. He avoided absolutes. He resisted romanticizing suffering. He spoke carefully, aware that language can misrepresent experience as easily as it can illuminate it. This carefulness was not evasive. It was respectful. Grief, he understood, does not belong to narrative. It belongs to those who carry it. As a result, the man who emerged from this period was quieter but more grounded, less visible but more complete. The world saw less of him, but what remained was more authentic. Love, work, and memory no longer competed for dominance. They existed in balance, each acknowledged for what it was and what it could not be. This phase did not offer resolution. It offered stability, not the kind built on certainty, but the kind built on acceptance. Redford did not claim peace in the traditional sense. He claimed equilibrium, a state in which loss was honored, love was preserved, and the need for external validation no longer dictated his choices. The consequences of his life's tragedies were not dramatic endings or grand reinventions. They were quiet recalibrations that allowed him to continue without denying what he had endured. In that quiet, something enduring took shape. Not a legacy meant for headlines, but a way of living that respected both sorrow and connection without forcing either into performance. There were moments in Robert Redford's life that never appeared in interviews, never found their way into biographies, and never fit the polished narrative that surrounded his career. These were the quiet intervals, the hours between obligations, when he allowed himself to confront thoughts he rarely shared. In those spaces, away from public expectation, he wrestled with emotions that had no audience and no resolution. For Robert Redford, these unspoken moments carried as much weight as any public milestone, shaping him in ways that fame could neither amplify nor erase. One such pattern was his habit of retreating into nature during periods of emotional strain. This was not a performative gesture tied to environmental advocacy, but a deeply personal ritual. Long walks without destination, time spent observing landscapes rather than controlling them, became a way to steady himself. He did not seek answers in these moments. He sought quiet. Friends noticed that after particularly difficult periods, he would disappear for days, sometimes weeks, returning calmer but more introspective. He rarely explained where he had been or what he had been thinking. The silence itself was the explanation. Another unspoken aspect of his life was the way he processed grief privately, almost methodically. Redford never embraced public mourning. When loss struck, he withdrew inward rather than outward. He avoided communal rituals that required shared expression, preferring solitary reflection. Those close to him recalled evenings when conversation drifted to memory, then stopped altogether. He listened more than he spoke, allowing others to fill the space while he absorbed their words without responding. This was not detachment. It was his way of honoring pain without turning it into spectacle. In relationships, this reserve often created misunderstandings. Some mistook his quiet for emotional distance, unaware that beneath it lived a deep sensitivity shaped by years of loss. Redford felt intensely, but he expressed emotions sparingly, choosing precision over abundance. When he spoke, it mattered. When he remained silent, it mattered more. This selective openness made him difficult to read, even for those closest to him. Yet it also protected something fragile inside him that he had learned could be easily overwhelmed. There were also creative rituals he rarely discussed. Before accepting or declining projects, he spent long hours alone, revisiting old notes, sketches, or films not to evaluate success, but to reconnect with intention. He asked himself whether the work aligned with who he was now, not who the world remembered him to be. This introspection led him to walk away from opportunities others would have considered essential. To him, refusing was an act of integrity. He no longer needed validation through participation. What mattered was coherence between inner life and outer action. Those who collaborated with him later in life noticed a gentler presence. He was less directive, more receptive. He listened to younger voices without asserting authority. His leadership shifted from control to trust. This change did not come from fatigue, but from reflection. He had learned that influence did not require dominance. It required example. This philosophy extended beyond work into personal interactions. He offered support quietly, without framing himself as mentor or guide. Advice, when given, was understated, almost reluctant. Perhaps the most revealing unspoken truth was how he approached love in this phase of life. Love no longer occupied a central, defining role. It existed as part of a broader emotional landscape that included solitude, memory, and acceptance. Redford did not speak of love as salvation. He spoke of it as companionship. This distinction mattered. He no longer sought someone to fill absence or repair damage. He sought shared presence, a mutual willingness to coexist with unresolved histories. In private moments, he acknowledged that earlier in life, he had asked too much of love. He had expected it to stabilize what grief had destabilized. Over time, he recognized that such expectations placed unbearable weight on intimacy. This realization did not arrive through theory, but through repetition and loss. By the time he embraced a quieter form of love, he had already learned what love could not do. That knowledge made what remained more honest. Another subtle aspect of his inner life was his relationship with regret. Redford did not dwell on alternate histories, but he did acknowledge moments he wished he had navigated differently. These reflections were not confessions of failure, but acknowledgments of limitation. He understood that youth does not come equipped with foresight, and that some understanding only emerges after consequence. Rather than attempting to rewrite the past, he integrated it into his present, allowing memory to inform rather than dominate. He also maintained a private discipline of gratitude that few noticed. Not gratitude as positivity, but as recognition. He recognized the rarity of having lived long enough to reflect, to adjust, to experience love without urgency. This awareness tempered his grief. It did not erase pain, but it placed it within a larger context of endurance. He understood that survival itself carried responsibility, not to perform resilience, but to live truthfully. These unspoken patterns formed the emotional architecture of his later years. They explain why his public confession felt restrained rather than revelatory. He was not unveiling a secret. He was articulating an understanding he had already lived with quietly. The words mattered less than the life that supported them. In the end, these silent practices, these unnoticed choices, reveal more about Robert Redford than any headline ever could. They show a man who learned, slowly and imperfectly, to coexist with loss without being defined by it. A man who discovered that the most meaningful truths are not always declared, but practiced day after day in the privacy of one's own reflection. As the years advanced and the noise of public life faded further into the background, Robert Redford began to think less about achievement and more about meaning. Not meaning as something to be proclaimed, but meaning as something lived quietly and consistently. By this stage, Robert Redford no longer measured his life through milestones or recognition. The question that occupied him was simpler and far more demanding. What remains when ambition loosens its grip? What endures when success is no longer the center of identity? His legacy, often discussed in terms of cinema, institutions, and cultural influence, took on a different shape in his own reflection. Films mattered, but not as monuments. They were expressions of moments, beliefs, and questions that belonged to specific chapters of his life. He did not view them as definitive statements, but as traces of an evolving conscience. This perspective allowed him to hold pride without attachment. He could acknowledge accomplishment without needing to defend it. The work stood on its own, separate from the man he had become. More important to him was the continuity of values. Environmental responsibility, artistic integrity, and respect for individual voice were not causes he adopted for image. They were extensions of a worldview shaped early by loss and later by reflection. Nature, in particular, remained central not because it offered escape, but because it demanded humility. He often spoke of the land as something that outlives personal narratives, something that places human struggle into proportion. This awareness influenced how he thought about time, aging, and contribution. Legacy, in this sense, was not about being remembered, but about not causing harm while passing through. His understanding of family also evolved into something less idealized and more honest. He recognized that love within families is rarely simple or symmetrical. It involves regret, misunderstanding, patience, and endurance. Rather than attempting to resolve these complexities, he accepted them as part of the human condition. The losses he experienced as a father did not lead him to bitterness. They deepened his compassion. He became more attentive to the quiet forms of care, the gestures that require no recognition. Presence mattered more than explanation. When reflecting on love, particularly in the later years of his life, Redford did not frame it as a defining achievement. Love was not something he pointed to as proof of fulfillment. Instead, it was woven into a broader philosophy of coexistence. Love, to him, meant allowing another person to remain themselves without interference. It meant resisting the urge to shape, rescue, or correct. This understanding stood in contrast to earlier expectations he had carried. He acknowledged, privately, that younger versions of himself confused intensity with depth. Time corrected that misunderstanding gently, but firmly. Aging itself became a teacher. Physical limitations imposed a different rhythm, one that required attention rather than resistance. He learned to listen to his body without resentment, to adjust without framing adaptation as loss. This attitude extended to emotional life as well. He no longer attempted to outrun sadness or suppress longing. He allowed emotions to exist without interpretation. This neutrality was not detachment. It was balance. It allowed him to remain open without being overwhelmed. The idea of influence also shifted. Redford became less concerned with shaping discourse and more attentive to nurturing continuity, supporting younger artists, protecting creative spaces, and encouraging independent voices felt more meaningful than personal visibility. He understood that the most lasting contributions often occur without acknowledgement. Teaching by example, stepping aside when necessary, and trusting others to carry ideas forward became central to his sense of purpose. In moments of solitude, he reflected on how little control anyone truly has over outcomes. This realization did not lead to resignation. It led to precision. He chose his actions carefully, aware that intention does not guarantee result, but it does shape integrity. This philosophy freed him from the need to justify choices to anyone beyond himself. It allowed him to accept that misunderstanding is inevitable and that clarity is something one owes primarily to one's own conscience. The sum of these reflections formed what might be called his quiet legacy, not a narrative designed for admiration, but a posture toward life rooted in restraint, responsibility, and acceptance. He did not seek to be remembered as a hero or icon. He sought to leave behind systems, values, and relationships that could continue without him. This humility distinguished his later years from the mythology that once surrounded him. In speaking about his life now, Redford did not offer conclusions. He offered perspective. He acknowledged that understanding is provisional, shaped by time and experience, never final. Love, loss, creativity, and responsibility are not chapters that close. They're ongoing negotiations. His willingness to remain engaged in that negotiation, even as the world slowed around him, defined the depth of his character more than any role he ever played. This stage of life did not promise resolution. It offered coherence, a way of holding contradictions without needing to solve them. In that coherence, Redford found a form of peace that did not depend on certainty or applause. It depended on alignment between values and action, between memory and presence. That alignment, quietly maintained, became the true measure of his legacy. In the closing stretch of his life, Robert Redford no longer felt compelled to shape how his story would be told. The need to define, clarify, or protect a narrative had gradually fallen away. What remained was a quiet acceptance that a life, once lived fully, does not belong solely to the person who lived it. It becomes a collection of impressions, memories, and meanings carried differently by each observer. At this stage, Robert Redford seemed at peace with that surrender. When he finally spoke about love, it was not framed as a revelation meant to resolve curiosity. It was closer to a closing reflection, offered without urgency. He did not attempt to summarize his life through romance, nor did he elevate love above loss. Instead, he placed it alongside everything else he had endured. Love, in his telling, was not a triumph over pain, but a companion to it. That distinction mattered. It suggested maturity rather than consolation, realism rather than fantasy. What lingered after his words was not a sense of completion, but of continuity. His story did not end with a lesson neatly packaged for admiration. It ended with questions left open. How does one measure a life marked equally by success and sorrow? How does love change when it arrives after grief rather than before it? These questions were not rhetorical. They reflected a worldview that resisted simplification. Redford did not offer guidance. He offered presence. The quiet confidence of someone who understands that ambiguity is not failure, but truth. Those who listened carefully noticed that his final reflections carried no bitterness. There was regret, acknowledged without apology, and gratitude, expressed without performance. He did not dwell on what might have been different. He focused instead on what remained real. Relationships that survived silence. Values that endured without reinforcement. Moments of connection that did not require explanation. This focus revealed a man who had learned to distinguish between what matters and what merely occupies attention. In the end, his legacy was less about the roles he played and more about the restraint with which he lived. He demonstrated that it is possible to step back without disappearing, to let go without resentment. His withdrawal from public life was not abandonment. It was a recalibration that allowed meaning to surface without noise. That choice challenged a culture obsessed with constant visibility. It suggested that relevance does not depend on presence, but on coherence. The emotional arc of his life, when viewed in full, does not follow a traditional heroic pattern. There is no single victory that redeems the losses. There is no final revelation that resolves the contradictions. Instead, there is a steady movement toward honesty, toward a form of living that accepts limitation without surrender. This honesty shaped how he loved, how he worked, and how he aged. It allowed him to remain open without being exposed, connected without being consumed. As the public continues to revisit his films and revisit the image they have long associated with his name, there is now an added layer of understanding. Behind the confidence was caution. Behind the independence was vulnerability. Behind the silence was not emptiness, but reflection. His confession did not dismantle the myth. It softened it. It allowed space for complexity where certainty once stood. The lasting impression is not one of nostalgia, but of respect. Respect for a man who chose discretion over disclosure, depth over display. His final words about love do not invite applause. They invite consideration. They ask the listener to reflect on their own assumptions about timing, fulfillment, and connection. In that sense, his story extends beyond biography. It becomes a mirror. There is no dramatic closing to this narrative, no definitive statement that ties every thread together. That absence is intentional. Redford understood that life resists summary. What he offered instead was an example of how to live with unresolved questions without being haunted by them, how to honor love without idealizing it, how to carry loss without allowing it to dominate identity. As silence settles again around his life, it no longer feels like retreat. It feels like completion of a different kind. Not an ending, but a pause that holds meaning. In that pause, the story remains open, not because it is unfinished, but because it continues to resonate differently with each person who encounters it. That, perhaps, is the most enduring legacy he leaves behind.